Okay, so think about like those times when you're really pushing yourself, academically.
Yeah.
Like maybe you're pulling all-nighters just to get that paper absolutely perfect, right?
Right.
And it feels like there's this idea that the more you're like that kind of perfectionist,
Yeah.
the better you're gonna do.
It's like this common assumption.
Yeah, but what
Right.
if that's not really the whole story? What if there's another side to it? What if that need to make everything perfect
Yeah.
actually kind of holds you back?
Yeah, that's actually what we're going to be diving into today. So, I mean,
Yeah.
you're here because you want to understand all these like really complex topics
Mm-hmm.
quickly, but like thoroughly.
Yeah.
And we have gone through tons of research to like try to bring you a really clear understanding of perfectionism
Uh-huh.
and how it actually affects academic success.
Mm-hmm.
You'll think of this as like your shortcut to all the essentials.
Totally. And our main source today is this meta-analysis. And it's a really robust piece of research.
Yeah.
Now imagine taking like dozens of studies on the same topic and
Yeah.
kind of putting them all together to
Yeah.
see like what are the bigger trends.
Yeah.
That's kind of the gist of what a meta-analysis does.
Exactly.
And so the one we're looking at today, specifically, it looked at 37 different studies
Wow.
with over 8,900 students.
That's a lot of students.
Yeah, from elementary school all the way through university.
So across the whole spectrum of education.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. And that was published in the Educational Psychology Review. So
Yeah.
really reputable journal
Yeah.
looking at how perfectionism plays out in all these educational settings.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we're going to do today is unpack what perfectionism actually means in this academic context
Yeah.
and try to figure out if it actually is a predictor of achievement like we all assume.
Right.
And if so, what are those key nuances that you need to understand?
Okay, so the first thing that kind of jumped out at me was
Uh-huh.
that perfectionism isn't really just like one single trait. It's more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
The researchers actually talk about it as having like these two sides.
And that's one of the things that this meta-analysis really dives into, what they call these perfectionistic strivings
Okay.
and perfectionistic concerns.
Okay.
And they're like these two different engines driving somebody who like wants to achieve.
So perfectionistic strivings, that sounds like the positive side, right?
Yeah.
So like you're setting these really high goals for yourself and you're working really hard to actually meet them.
Exactly. So you're driven to be the best you can be.
Yeah.
And you set those standards high for yourself and you go after them.
Right. And it makes sense intuitively that that would lead to better results because you're putting in so much effort.
And they actually looked at the motivational factors associated with that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's things like engaging with your studies
Uh-huh.
and perseverance,
Mm-hmm.
like really pushing through challenges
Yeah.
and generally just putting in the effort required to do well.
Okay, so you have those high standards and it can be a real motivator. But then you have the other side, the perfectionistic concerns, and this sounds like the more kind of troublesome aspect.
Yeah, it's like the dark side of perfectionism,
Yeah.
where you're worried about making mistakes and you're constantly feeling like you're not quite good enough.
Right.
And anytime you fall short of that perfect performance,
Yeah.
you have this really negative reaction.
So it's like instead of being motivated to actually achieve something, it's like you're so worried about failing.
It's like this fear of failure is driving you.
Right.
And it can lead to all these like unhelpful thought patterns,
Mm-hmm.
like anxiety and worry.
Yeah.
And it can actually lead to things like procrastination.
Oh, totally.
Because if you're terrified of not doing something perfectly,
Right.
the easiest thing to do is just to avoid doing it.
Avoid it altogether. Yeah, it's like that pressure cooker feeling where you're so afraid of messing up that you just don't even start. So going into this big analysis, were the researchers expecting that both of these sides would lead to positive academic outcomes, or was there a difference?
So they had a pretty clear hypothesis about the perfectionistic strivings.
Okay.
They thought because of that connection with motivation and hard work, that it would probably be positively associated with achievement.
Yeah.
But for the concerns, it was less clear.
Mm-hmm.
There were kind of conflicting theories about whether that anxiety and that aversion to mistakes would actually help or hinder
Right.
academic performance.
So we've got these two distinct elements of perfectionism.
Mm.
What did the research actually show?
So the big findings were that they found a small to medium positive relationship between those perfectionistic strivings,
Okay.
so the high standards,
Mm-hmm.
and academic achievement.
So that initial idea held up.
Yeah, so aiming high is generally associated with better grades and test scores.
Okay.
And it's like that drive to excel can actually give you a measurable boost in your performance.
Okay, that's kind of what a lot of people probably think. Yeah.
So what about the perfectionistic concerns?
So that actually showed a significant but small negative relationship.
This is going the opposite direction.
It is.
Okay.
So while it wasn't a huge effect, it does suggest that those worries about mistakes and that feeling inadequate can actually hold you back.
Yeah, it's like the anxiety almost creates like a drag on your potential.
Right. And I think that's one of the big takeaways here for the listener.
Yeah,
It's not just about being a perfectionist, it's about what kind of perfectionist you are.
totally.
And this is where it gets really interesting because what they also found was a moderate positive overlap between these two.
Oh,
So a lot of times the same person can have high standards and also be really worried about not meeting them.
so they go hand in hand.
They do.
Okay.
So you could be somebody who's pushing themselves incredibly hard, but also feeling really stressed and anxious.
Right. That sounds like kind of a tough place to be.
It's like walking this tightrope.
And because they so often go together,
Yeah.
it makes it harder to figure out which one is really influencing that academic achievement.
Right. So how do you know if the positive outcomes are because of the striving
Yeah.
or if they're happening in spite of the concerns?
That's a really good point. And so to try to pinpoint the unique contribution of each aspect, they use the statistical method to kind of take out that overlap.
Okay.
So like if you imagine these two circles that overlap,
Yeah.
they wanted to see what each circle contributed on its own
Yeah.
outside of that shared space.
Okay. So what did they find when they looked at it that way?
So even after they took out the overlap, the perfectionistic striving still showed that small to medium positive relationship,
Okay.
which really reinforces the idea that drive for high standards has a genuine positive effect.
So it's not just that they're both happening at the same time, that the striving actually is doing something?
Exactly.
Okay, what about the concerns once you remove the influence of the striving?
So the perfectionistic concerns showed a larger, small negative relationship
Right.
with academic achievement.
So it's having a more pronounced effect when you separate it out.
Exactly. And that suggests that the negative impact of those worries might be kind of masked when they're mixed in with the striving.
Mm-hmm.
But when you isolate them, that detrimental effect on your academic performance becomes a little bit clearer.
So it really is pulling people down more than we realize.
It is. And that's why understanding these nuances is so important.
Yeah.
It's not just about is perfectionism good or bad.
Right.
It's about these different shades within it.
Okay, so we know there's a connection,
Uh-huh.
and we know that the type of perfectionism really matters.
Yeah.
Did they look at anything else that might influence this relationship?
Yeah, they looked at a few different things.
Okay.
One of them was like how you measure perfectionism,
Okay.
because you can imagine different surveys might focus on different aspects.
Right, different ways of asking about it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they did find that this specific instrument used could significantly influence the results. Yeah, particularly when it came to the concerns.
Okay.
So depending on how researchers were asking about and assessing those concerns,
Yeah.
sometimes they got different answers about how it affected achievement.
So the lens you use to look at it can actually change what you see.
Exact.
Can you give some specific examples of how different measures lead to different results?
Yeah, so for example, when studies used a specific set of questions that focused on striving for perfection,
Uh-huh.
this was actually from a tool that's used in sports psychology,
Oh, interesting.
but they adapted it for education.
Okay.
They found a stronger positive link to achievement
Okay.
compared to studies that use more general measures of striving.
So the more targeted questions showed a stronger connection to success.
Exactly. And on the concern side, they found that this discrepancy subscale,
Okay.
which measures that feeling of not living up to your own standards,
Right.
showed stronger negative effects
Okay.
compared to other ways of measuring those concerns.
So constantly feeling like you're falling short, even if you're objectively doing well.
Yeah, that specific concern can be really damaging.
Yeah.
And another interesting thing they found was that a subscale, looking at negative reactions to imperfection,
Mm-hmm.
actually showed a positive relationship.
Really?
Yeah, in a couple of studies.
Well, that goes against the trend.
It does.
Yeah.
Now, it's important to note that that was only based on a couple of studies,
Yeah.
so we need more research on that.
Right.
But it is interesting that maybe those who are really bothered by their mistakes
Yeah.
might be more motivated to fix them.
Right. Like it motivates them in a different way.
Exactly. But yeah, more research is definitely needed.
Okay. So what's the takeaway for our listener here?
I think the key takeaway is that when we talk about perfectionism, the specific angle that we're looking at can lead to really different understandings of how it affects us.
So it's not just enough to say I'm a perfectionist. You need to understand what flavor of perfectionism.
Exactly. Which aspects are most prominent for you? And how are those affecting your academic life?
So did they look at any other factors, like maybe
Mhm.
gender or level of education?
Yeah, they did look at whether gender or the level of education the student was in.
Okay.
So whether they were in primary school or secondary school or university
Huh.
might change that relationship.
Okay.
And interestingly, they didn't find strong evidence that gender or academic level significantly changed that relationship.
So it's pretty consistent across the board.
Yeah, it seems like across those groups, the general trends held pretty steady.
So you might think like the pressures and ways perfectionism shows up would be different as you go through different levels of education.
You would, but at least in this analysis, it seems like the fundamental links between those two dimensions of perfectionism and how you do in school were fairly consistent.
Okay, so how we measure it seems important.
Yeah.
Things like gender and what level of school you're in didn't really change things too much.
Right.
Now, one thing I always wonder about with these meta-analyses is, you often hear that studies that show a strong effect
Yeah.
are more likely to get published. So
Right.
do we have to worry about that here?
That's a really important point, and it's called publication bias,
Okay.
which is that tendency for studies with statistically significant results to be more likely to get published.
Right.
And so to address that, the researchers in this meta-analysis used a couple of statistical techniques
Okay.
to investigate whether this might be an issue.
And what did they find?
So the results of those tests, including things like the fail-safe number and Egger's regression,
Okay.
provided very little evidence to suggest that there was significant publication bias in this meta-analysis.
So it sounds like we can be pretty confident in what they found.
Exactly. It suggests that the findings are a pretty reliable overview of the research.
Okay. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways that you think our listeners should really remember about perfectionism and academic achievement?
I think the biggest takeaway is that it's not as simple as we might initially think.
Yeah.
Being a perfectionist doesn't automatically equal doing well in school.
Right.
It really depends on which aspect of perfectionism is driving you.
Right.
So those perfectionistic strivings, those high standards, and the drive to achieve them can actually be a positive force,
Mm-hmm.
to actually be a real motivator in your academic life.
But on the flip side, those perfectionistic concerns, all that worry about making mistakes and having a negative reaction when you're not perfect, that can actually hold you back.
Yeah, and those two often go together.
Yeah.
But understanding their distinct effects, I think, is the key here.
So for our listener who's here to understand this complex topic really quickly and thoroughly, what do they need to know?
It's not about abandoning high standards,
Okay.
but it's about managing those anxieties and those worries that come along with it.
Yeah, I love that.
So you want to cultivate that drive for excellence, but you don't want to be trapped by the fear of not being perfect.
I think the real aha moment for me is that perfectionism isn't just this one thing. It's these two distinct forces, and it's the balance between them that matters.
That's such a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And it kind of leads us to this final thought for our listener.
Okay.
Considering those two different sides, the drive to achieve and that fear of failing, how might understanding your own tendencies in each of those areas help you to develop a more effective approach to your learning goals?
Yeah.
So it's about that self-awareness and maybe shifting your focus from this pursuit of perfect perfection to an embrace of learning and growth, even with those inevitable imperfections that we all have.
That's such great food for thought.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully this deep dive has given you a much clearer understanding of perfectionism and its real impact on academic achievement.
Yeah, I hope you found this really helpful.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
It's been fun.
Yeah, it has.
All right, see you next time. See you.